All right, hey everyone, and good afternoon. Welcome to CDRW's 8th annual forum. Appreciate you joining breakout number 1, Flex Flow Management Program. I just want to cover a few housekeeping logistics before we dive in. So this session is being recorded and it will be shared on CDRW's website the following week. So if you're unable to catch everything and want to glance back, you certainly can. Or if you know one of your colleagues or friends that really wanted to join and couldn't be here today, that will be available. We have muted everyone in this session as well, so feel free to utilize the chat box function on the lower part of your screen to ask any type of question. We're asking folks to really be directive with their questions as well, making sure it goes to a particular panelist or speaker. That way there's no confusion. As well, if you are having any technical issues, please let me know. My name is Kelly Knutson. I'm the State Policy Manager with the Coalition of the Delaware River Watershed. You should be able to just directly message me and we can get all your technical issues figured out. I've also linked in the chat box the forum schedule. So that's available via Sketch, which is a website online. Feel free to indicate which sessions you're interested in going to. That way we have a rough estimate of who's coming to what. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Jeff Skelding, Executive Director at Friends of the Upper Delaware, to cover our speakers.
Thank you, Kelly. Okay, I'm Jeff Skelding. I'm with Friends of the Upper Delaware River up here in Hancock, New York, up in the headwaters section of the Delaware River system. We do a lot of work with this thing we're going to talk a lot about today, the Flexible Flow Management Program, which guides the governance of the New York City reservoirs that are at the headwaters of the system, have a lot to do with the whole river system. And just real briefly, a little bit of history here. My organization, Friends of the Upper Delaware River, and I know there's a couple of folks on the call that have been involved in this for years, including Dan Plummer and Sherry Resty Thomas and Rich Thomas and Molly Oliver. They all know that for years, when we first came in contact with the Coalition for the Delaware River Watershed, we spent a lot of time and energy trying to explain this flexible flow management program and why it was so important, not just to the Upper Delaware River, which is, of course, where, among other things, we have this famous, world famous wild trout fishery that in large part is there because of the cold, clean water that is released from these reservoirs up here, Cannonsville, Papactum, and Neversink. But we also knew that the operations of the New York City reservoirs had a lot to do with the entire river system. And David Wunsch is going to talk from the state of Delaware, is going to talk in a little bit about, give some good examples of that, I think. But it was a hard concept to get across for a number of years to the coalition, not because they were resistant, just because it was not the easiest thing to explain, really. Finally did it, and now, flash forward to now, the coalition has adopted the Flexible Flow Management Program the last 2 years, I think, Kelly, maybe even 3, as one of their top policy priorities. So the work that we do, Friends of the Upper Delaware River and Trout Unlimited and Peter Kolesar and Jim Serio and everybody up here, now has the attention and additional resources from the down basin community that, as we said, we believe is very much impacted by the operations of the reservoirs, and that is evident today, given our lineup of speakers that we have here. So I'm going to quickly go through our speakers in the order that they will speak, and then I'll give you just a little bit of timing and audience participation instructions as well. So our first speaker is going to be Dr. Peter Kolesar, who is Professor Emeritus from Columbia University. He is a veteran of the FFMP, both its formation and its operation. Peter's going to give what I hope is going to be the foundation for this entire discussion, which is kind of what is this creature we call the FFMP? How does it work? What does it mean? Where did it start from? Where is it now? That kind of thing. So I hope it really sets the stage for the following speakers, which are representatives from all of the states and the city of New York, collectively referred to often as the decree parties. And you'll learn a little bit more about what that means in a second. And they are, and we just decided to go from, since the CDRW has decided to focus on the state of New York this year as their theme, we decided to start with the state of New York. So Brennan Tarrier there on your screen is with the Division of Water from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and is probably the top expert in the state of New York on the FFMP. Next up will be Jennifer Garigliano. She's Chief of Staff, Bureau of Water Supply, New York City Department of Environmental Protection. Following Jennifer will be Liaghat, Chief Clean Water State Planning, Clean Water State Planning Section, Office of Resource Pennsylvania, Office of Water Resources Pennsylvania DEP, sorry about that. Steve Domber will follow Haas. He is Section Chief for Water Resources, New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. And then David Wunsch, the patient David Wunsch, who always seems to go last because he's down there in Delaware, but certainly last but certainly not least, David is PhD Director and State Geologist with the Delaware Geographical Survey. Those will be the speakers. They'll each go about 7 minutes, and we've asked them to focus their comments on the following questions. What is your state or city, in case of Jennifer, level of satisfaction with the FFMP to date? What are the strengths and weaknesses of the FFMP? How could the FFMP evolve in the future? What is the most significant impact of the FFMP to your region? And we will post those questions when it's time, so you'll all be looking at them, as will the speakers. So with that, unless I missed anything, Kelly, we're going to jump right in with Peter Kolesar. Peter, no one else has slides, but Peter does have slides. So Peter, I know you practiced quite a bit with this. I hope you can pull it off with no problem here. Peter Kolesar, go ahead.
First of all, unmute myself. Second, get my share screen up here. Okay, and here we go. So my mission really is, as Jeff explained, to give an overview of this very, very complicated system, and one that designed to control waters coming out of the reservoirs does have an impact all the way down to Delaware Bay. And I'm going to try to stick to facts, but there'll be quite a few opinions in here. So this is a personal perspective, and I expect that my comments will be complemented by, and maybe in some ways disagreed with or amplified by our other speakers. By way of background, I'm basically a retired applied mathematician from Columbia and a fly fisherman. So I got into this by accident. I kind of turned my hobby into what turned into a full-time research agenda for a good number of years. So let's start off with some background and some history. First of all, the basics. What is the FFMP? And those words are important. Flexible Flow Management Program. So it's meant to be flexible in a number of ways. And it is really the set of rules for managing water releases from into the Delaware from the 3 New York City dams on the headwaters. The FFMP augments and takes off from the 1954 Supreme Court decree. Does not replace it. It's a set of rules that are in addition to the Supreme Court rules. It is a dynamic agreement among the 5 parties to the decree, which are the states, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New York City. We say parties to the decree, that they are signatories to the original decree. A dynamic, which means it is changeable. It originated in 2007. It's been revised several times, most recently in 2017. The objectives of the FFMP are to balance issues of urban water supply. So realize now that New York City is involved, Philadelphia is involved, Trenton is involved, Central New Jersey is involved. So we have urban water supply, major issues. They're why the dams exist, drought management, flood mitigation, and wildlife habitat protection are the big objectives. The current version, called FFMP 2017, expires in May 2018. It's a 10-year range, but with a possible revision point, possible major revisions in May 2023 at the pleasure of the decree parties. And it's important for us to all realize and remember that changes to the FFMP require unanimous agreement among the decree parties. That's both the strength of the FFMP, and it has been a difficulty that anyone disagreeing with anything has the potential for exercising a kind of veto. By background, let me start out by talking a little bit about the underlying Delaware water management issues as I see them, and hence these are FFMP issues. First is water supply in the Delaware watershed. It's limited, it's highly variable, and it is very seasonal. And it's seasonal in a dysfunctional way. That is, water supply is lowest in the summer when water needs are highest. And importantly, the decree parties, as best I understand right now, do not currently agree on the magnitude of the available water. So there have been disputes, there are potential disputes in the future on that issue. Very important, the New York City dams, what's called the PCN system, the Pacton-Cansville Neversink system, can only store about 1 year's usage. So we're not talking about a system such as they have out west of monster dams storing huge amounts of water, which means that this water has to be husbanded and spent very, very carefully. Also, there are competing water interests among the decree parties themselves and among the other river stakeholders, such as myself and my fishing buddies and property owners along the river, the oystermen down in the bay, canoe liveries, etc. Over the years, there have been significant droughts, 1965 being the big one, the drought of the century, and our research at Columbia shows that that was the most significant drought going back to 1754. And floods, very recent one in memory of many of us will be the flood of 2006 on the Delaware. Climate change is likely to have substantial water-related impacts on the region, and the decree parties, the DRBC, are committed to be studying this. To get a sense of the complexity here without getting, since I am an engineer, here's how I look at the system. You got these three big pots of water at the headwaters, the three dams. They lead into the west branch, the east branch, and the Neversink. And very, very important is the gauge at Montague, New Jersey, which appears in the Supreme Court decree, and the decree dictate that the city maintain, and that is the FFMP, maintain a flow of 1,750 CFS at that gauge every day, 365 days a year. And not to scale, way downriver, there's a gauge at Trenton, which is very important because it's related to the intrusion, possible intrusion of salt water into the system and into the Trenton water supply. On top of that is that these dams were constructed by New York City for water supply. So New York City has the right under the Supreme Court decree and under the FFMP to divert up to 800 million gallons per day of water from these reservoirs at its pleasure, in a sense. That is, it has a bound on the amount, but it's New York City's decision as to from which of these reservoirs it takes that water and in what sequence. Complicated stuff, guys, right? So the FFMP, as I see it, is an imperfect resolution to 60 years of environmental struggle. The 54 decree allocated water to New York City. It put a constraint on flows in the mid-Delaware, and it provided for out-of-date basin diversions to New York City. But there's not a word about the environment. So what happened is we've had since 1954, environmentalists, largely fisher people, have been complaining, and the FFMP itself arose explicitly out of the fishermen's complaints and from a coalition of fishing researchers that made suggestions for what the policy should be. So very, very related to this environmental stress. There were 50 years of this stress, a history of low and erratic releases in the river. I'll give you just one example. August 1973, releases from Tennantsville were as low as 30 CFS into the river. That means you could not get your ankles wet crossing the river. It takes 300 CFS to simply wet the river bank to bank. So this was putting the environment in peril, and the fishing environmental community went berserk over these issues year after year after year. Finally, in 1976, the fishermen in New York State persuaded New York State and the government of New York State to impose minimum conservation decree flows on the other decree parties. And that led to the first Delaware conservation release policy. Since then, we've had 9 revisions of that policy leading up to the FFMP in 2007. From 77 to 2006, I call it a Rube Goldberg complex of rules evolved that satisfied no one. In fact, the minimum conservation releases from Cannonsville during that period averaged 104 CFS, roughly a third of what the fishing conservationists think was the absolute minimum. By 2005, the decree parties themselves were dissatisfied with the rules. They committed to a science-based, complete, thorough revision, but took no action to actually design one. And that's when I and my colleagues in the coalition entered the picture. What happened is that there was a tremendous heat wave in December of 2005. Temperatures went way up river. The reservoirs were essentially at normal capacity, yet there was a very, very small release into the river. It just didn't make any sense. It infuriated everyone. FUDR, Trout Unlimited, Delaware River Foundation called for emergency releases of water. The decree parties denied those requests, even though there was plenty of water in the reservoir, and the explanation was that the thermal bank was depleted. This is what drove me and my colleagues to action. So I then formed a coalition, a research coalition, including members of the Nature Conservancy, National Trout Unlimited, Delaware River Foundation, Theodore Gordon Fly Fishers, to start mathematical analysis. They use the kind of skills I've used on other kinds of problems on this issue. Our focus was to see if we could design release policies that better balance the ecological needs of the upper river against the water storage risks the decree parties. Essentially, what the decree parties in New York City were doing was holding water back. Kind of their theme was the drought of the century might start tomorrow, and so they were being very conservative in holding back the water. My view eventually was, from the statistics, was that they were being too conservative. So our initial findings was back to 2006, 2005, when I started this research. We found that the existing policies failed to meet its own temperature objectives. They had objectives written in the rules, and they were unable to meet them. They produced erratic and low river flows, and the rules were so complicated that it was difficult to administer. It actually took a member of the New York State DEC to administer this, and it was a hell of a job. The key design flaw that we found, and there was not agreement on this at the beginning, was that the design was that the worst case would happen and that New York City would need all of its 800 billion gallons every day, 365 days a year. But in fact, it wasn't doing that. It was only using 550. So acting in this super conservative way meant they held back water in the reservoir, but that water had to go somewhere. And what would happen in the spring, 30% of the water that came into the reservoirs was spilled. That is, from our viewpoint, essentially wasted. And in addition, the rules were very rigid with regard to seasonal needs and rigid with regard to the actual water in the reservoir. So that was the starting point of this research. We also found that a simple patch wasn't going to work. There was a recommendation from the fishing community for a simple 600 CFS release from Cannonsville all summer that would have been good for the fish, for the fishermen, but would have depleted reservoir storage to an extent that we judge unacceptable to the decree parties. Instead, we used some industrial theory of inventory, simulations, and statistical analysis to find that you could design a protocol that was tuned to the seasons, that took account of the actual amount of water in the reservoir, and tune this to reduce the wasteful spills, get more water into the river, and not imperil the city or Philadelphia or Trenton, etc. Our preliminary results interested New York State DEC, and that began a many months, about 9-month collaboration between the Columbia team and New York State DEC researchers, and that led from our initial proposal to what became the 2007 FFMP. So there's a bit of that history. So now a few words about the FFMP, the structure, how it works. And this isn't easy to explain. The idea is simple. Here's a chart of reservoir storage. It's percentage of reservoir capacity. And the two lines, the blue line and the orange line, define the space between them as being so-called normal reservoir storage. The judgment is, and these curves were derived way back in the 1970s by New York State DEC. They've proven to be pretty good rules. As long as you keep the water in that range, you're not going to get in real trouble. If you drop below the orange line, you're in danger of drought, of running out of water, and the releases should be cut back. If you get above that line, there's danger of spill and flooding, and the releases should be increased. That's the basic, simple idea of the thing. And my slide here should illustrate those rules. Okay. So now let's get into a little more detail. That's a simple concept. How do they actually implement it? Well, they implement it by defining 10 seasons of a year. They implement it by defining 8 water availability levels, which are computed by New York City. And they implement it by adding 2 additional drought curves. In all, I counted this up, 930 numbers make up the FFMP, okay? And in addition, there are reserved special banks of water for special purposes. So the chart I showed you gets more complicated. No need for us to go into the details here, but it's more complicated. Well-intentioned, more complicated. The actual releases come from tables, which are published. And there are 8 of these tables, depending on how much water New York City judges is available. Those tables have got 3 parts, 1 for each reservoir. They've got 10 seasons, which are the columns. They have a bunch of rows, which are the levels of the water. It's a complicated thing to understand. So it goes on and on and on. There are 8 of them. Okay. So to simplify this a little bit, for the fishing guys at least, what are we interested in? We are interested in what happens when conditions are normal during the summer. I hope I'm pointing it out to you. It's level L2, normal releases from the Cannonsville Reservoir in the summer is probably the single number of most importance to the fishing community. Okay? And the complaint that the fishermen had was that the original design, which we participated in but complained about, made that number only 250 CFS. We knew you needed more. By now, we've evolved to FFMP 2017. That number's evolved to 500. So although all these numbers are important, some numbers are more dominant than others, and it really takes quite a bit of study to understand the dynamic between them all. You could look at the River Masters website and get a picture of what's going on. Here's the most recent chart that I see from the River Masters website. I'm indicating to you the line here that shows actual storage. The actual storage as of today is in the upper normal range, which says that we are looking pretty good looking ahead. There's a goodly supply of water. New York City diversions currently are about 600 million gallons per day. The Cannonsville release is about 450. So we're operating in a kind of normal situation right now, thank God. Okay, now what has MFFP accomplished? And so there's a dispute. Everyone's not happy with the FFMP. I'm pretty satisfied because we achieved our major objectives. First, in the 12 years prior to the FFMP, 31% of the water that came into the reservoirs was spilled. Spilling isn't entirely bad. You need some spilling to flush out the river, but 31% spilling was a waste of a lot of water. As a consequence of that, of holding back that much water, the minimum Cannonsville release over that time period was only 31 CFS. I said, I'm not exaggerating in saying I could not get my ankles wet walking across the river at that release level. So now go down and look with me at the 12 years of the FFMP. the FFMP has achieved its objective of reducing spills to 12%, and at no real cost and risk to New York City or the decree parties, because the thing that's very important to them is that reservoirs refill by June 1st. 12 years prior, 10 out of 12 years it refilled. The 12 years of FFMP, 12 years out of 12. And the overall releases went up, the minimum release from 31 to 267. So I would say, from my viewpoint, a partial success at least, and I know that there are others who might dispute that opinion, but that's the kind of the facts of the matter. And you get a very detailed picture of the FFMP and how it operates from reports published annually by the DRBC, published on their website. Amy Shellcross, who's on this line, is the author of those excellent reports. Now, the criticism of the original FFMP. Well, I alluded to originally, it was designed as if New York City would actually use its 800 million gallons allotment, and it didn't. And that got us into excessively conservative release policy and the bad consequences of that. So, for example, on this slide, I state that in 2007, which was the year before the FFMP really began in operation, the normal summertime releases out of Catskills were only 250 CFS, and the river went into thermal stress 18 days that first summer, which the fishing community judged to be unsatisfactory. We saw that. Jim Serio and I then proposed. We said, it's crazy not to link releases to what New York City actually needs, to their forecast of what they actually need. And we did simulations of that. We realized that that could justify increasing the releases from 250 to 600, that would be feasible. And in addition, the Joint Fisheries White Paper, the research done by New York State, DC, and Pennsylvania Fish and Boating Commission, in a similar fashion, also suggested such improvements, all moving to the fact that you really could have a system that would provide the water the fisheries needed and hold back the water that the city and the decree parties needed. That was reasonable. But still, in those early years of the FFMP, we're still operating in a kind of imperfect fashion. Now, I want to show you this page here, but in the interest of time, I don't want to take a lot of time speaking to it. It's for reference for you to go back to it. These are the calculations that New York City does. There's a major, major improvement to the FFMP when New York City implemented their OST, called Operations Support Tool System. And what it did is it forecasted the inflows, essentially over the coming year. It forecasted what the diversions would be over the coming year. It took into account that they wanted to have the reservoirs full on June 1st and did the arithmetic that led us to how much water was available, how many days were left in the planning period, and that gave us this bottom line number. Here it is, 513 on this particular day, August 13th of this year. 513 million gallons a day were available to the river to be used. And then New York City does some other adjustments that appear in the FFMP. They go to those tables and they figure out exactly what is released. It's a very, very sensible system, and it has been a marked improvement because it has allowed us to use the water in a still prudent way, but a way that benefits the environment. And all this data is posted regularly on the River Masters website. And now a few words about something that's concerned us for the last decade, thermal issue. Here's the fact. Trout are cold water fish. The reservoir water that comes out is cold when it leaves the dam, but it warms up as it goes downriver. It can get too warmer for the trout in summer heat waves. So a possible solution is to release more cold water at such times. We have been asking for many years that that be done, but there was a resistance on the part of the decree parties. Again, I think out of their interest in husbanding water. So in the early years, we knew there was not enough water coming out, and over the early years of the FFMP, there were a number of these thermal stress events when the water got too hot, and it provoked a crisis with the fishing community agitating for more water, the decree parties having to decide whether to respond or not. And eventually, Eventually, in 2017, the new FFMP, the decree parties agreed to institute a thermal mitigation protocol, which came out of research by our team at Columbia and from New York State DEC and Pennsylvania Fish and Boats Commission. All that analysis showed that it's possible prudently to allocate some special water for special pulses of cold water during heat waves. So now that's where we are. FFMP, the last improvement there was to implement such a protocol, and with a budget of 2,500 CFS days of water, and the DRBC subcommittee on ecological flows that several of us are members of participated in guiding the implementation. Just a few words about the implementation. It's been implemented over the last 2 years, 2019, 2020. Summer of 2019, luckily not a very hot summer. 6 thermal releases were made over 17 days, spread out. They used a little bit more than half the water that was allocated. They kept the temperatures at our target site, Lordville, were kept below stress threshold of 75 degrees, except for 1 day. So things really worked quite nicely. The story this summer, 2020, is a bit different. A very hot summer. 7 thermal releases were made over a 34-day period. Very, very complicated. What was done by New York State DEC, Brennan, operating this in a very calculated, clever, and I think reasonably successful way, but now used almost all of the bank. Despite the releases, the 75-degree limit was exceeded only slightly on the 10 days, and the highest temperature was 76 degrees on July 20th. My judgment is that had those thermal releases not been made, the Lordville temperatures would have exceeded the thermal limit much more frequently. So I would say that this was sort of at least a partial success. Important, something we're concerned about as of today, is that thermal bank has only a little bit of water left in it, 170 CFS days, and that bank has to carry over into May of next year and could well be depleted, something a number of us on the call are concerned about. So now let me get to a lead into my other speakers with my observations on what I consider to be open FFMP issues. Okay, first, there is not agreement among the decree parties about how much water there is in this system, in the Delaware system, or in the larger New York City system. So realizing that the city gets roughly half its water from the Delaware, half its water from the rest of the system. So the magnitude of water available and the matter of the water that could be available in drought situations is very important, and there is not currently agreement on that number. That's a fundamental research issue. The FFMP incorporates the 1954 decree's rigid, and I would say dysfunctional, Montague flow target of 1,700 CFS every day of the year, 365 days of the year, whether it's needed ecologically or not. Doesn't make any sense. It made some sense in 1954. It doesn't make sense today with our ecological and environmental knowledge. In drought conditions, the FFMP is still stacked against the upper river. The reductions in flows into the upper river take a disproportional reduction as compared to the reductions of everyone else. The impact of climate change, particularly related to sea level rise on water allocations, is not understood and is of concern. The impact of water releases on trout, we understand pretty well. There's been a lot of research on that. But the impact on other species, including shad, oysters, sturgeon, and the federally endangered dwarf wedge mussels, is not so well understood. If, this is a big one for me actually, if the decree parties fail to maintain unanimous agreement on the FFMP or its extension, Delaware water policy reverts to the dysfunctional 1983 archaic revision 1 rules, in which the decree parties would be shooting themselves in the foot by forcing back to that. And we've had that happen. We've had that happen in recent years, that we went back to those rules. So that's a very unattractive aspect of the FFMP. The FFMP uses this concept of bank accounting system for allocating water for ecological purposes. It's a screwy system. has a situation where the banks, which are a water allocation, could be exhausted. You would not be permitted to take ecological action, and the reservoir could be full. It could even be spilling. Good crazy. With over 300 parameters, the FFMP structure is unnecessarily complex and difficult to understand. And it incorporates a well-intentioned but kind of kooky planning cycle. The UST planning cycle runs to the water year, to June 1st. So if you stand on May 31st, the planning cycle is exactly 1 day long, okay? If you stand on June 2nd, the planning cycle is 364 days long. That could and should be corrected and modified. Finally, the main models that we as outsiders at Columbia used for design and evaluation of water policies, two particular ones, the OASIS simulation model of the river and the US Geological Survey DSS fish habitat model. Two important models without which we could not have designed the FFMP to start with, have not been adequately updated or made available for use by stakeholders. So to a large extent, many of us, and I think many of the decree parties, are operating in a black box situation. And with that, and I hope that I have kept close to my time limit. Thank you very much, folks.
Great, thank you, Peter. We're going to hold questions till the end. And we're just doing them through the chat box, right, Kelly? That's how questions are coming in.
That's correct. Yep.
Okay. So, if for those of you that were paying close attention, I hope what you heard was an excellent recap of the FFMP with a slight bias intentionally towards the upper river and the fishing community, which is Peter's long history, and he's been a great advocate up here. What makes this more complex, though, of course, is everybody else's needs. The down basin states and the city of New York also have needs for Delaware River water and have opinions on New York City reservoir management. That's what adds this complex, multi-dimensional complex discussion that constantly goes on here about how this water, where this water goes and how much of it goes where. And that's who we're going to hear from next. So starting at the top, Brennan Tarrier has an interesting position. He represents the state of New York in the Division of Water and keeps a close eye on reservoir management. And of course, the upper river fishery is primarily in the state of New York. Some of it is in the state of Pennsylvania, the trout fishery. So he kind of has to keep his eye on two things here, pure water management, but also the protection of the upper river fishery. So Brennan, go ahead. You can take it away. When we have the questions that you can see on your screen here that we're asking all of the next set of speakers to address. So, okay, Brennan.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, Peter. That was an excellent introduction. I think it helped everybody understand what we're starting with. And you did mention almost every point I'm about to make, so I think that's a good sign. My name is Brennan Tarrier. I'm with New York State DEC. I've been working on the Delaware River Basin water sharing project since 2007. For FFMP, New York State's level of satisfaction to date is relatively high. We've had good, for the most part, good water conditions since it was implemented. It was definitely better than previous versions of the FFMP, better than the reversion year where we operate under revision 1, and for the most part, much better than previous programs. That interim period, 1977 through 2007, we were really working off of yearly renewals of experimental plans. It was hard to plan ahead. You were spending most of your time negotiating the next year's program or dealing with crises as they arose. I think that's one of the biggest strengths of this FFMP, is that it's a breakthrough in its length and its scope. It has 2 5-year phases. We're in the first 5-year phase now, and we're committed to renewing for the second 5-year phase if those milestones are met. There's certain binding milestones on research and continued collaboration that the decree parties committed themselves to be completed for the second phase to begin in 2023. And I think that collaboration has continued, and we've seen some progress moving towards those goals. And I think that length and that scope is one of the biggest strengths. For weaknesses, I want to start with my weaknesses. Is that first, as Peter noted, the complexity can hinder public understanding. It can be hard enough for people who are dealing with this every day to understand it. You really have to be reading them line by line in order to get the right picture on it, and you have to come back to it multiple times, and that's for experts who are doing this every day. The public understanding, it really takes it takes a jump to get there. You have to do a lot of homework in order to understand the time period that the different parameters that Peter described that are going to affect today's release or today's conditions. So that complexity, I think part of that deals with the next topic that I have, the next weakness. The 2007 FFMP carries over a lot of the pre-existing, I want to say baggage. Baggage is a loaded term, but I think it's possibly relevant. I think the FFMP 2017 kind of builds off of every one of those previous agreements since 1977. So everything that every party has gotten, the FFMP was written in accordance with that. Even going back to the Supreme Court decree, the FFMP 2017 was not written from the ground up. It included all of the previous goals and constraints of the previous 65 years. And so that can make that generates a lot of that complexity because it has so much of that. Again, I was trying to think of a better word than baggage, but I couldn't. Another big weakness, Peter also alluded to, that this is a conservative plan. The drought record of the 1960s has been estimated with a return period of anywhere from 200 to some people say 500 years. That's an exceedingly dire situation that is it's relatively rare to design for. That is a fairly high standard to meet. So the choices that you have to make in such a dire situation are going to be pointed, and it's going to be hard to come to an agreement on. And then the other tough situations that we're looking at more closely now after this last agreement was signed is climate change and sea level rise. Those are both directly pointed at the Delaware River water resources and their availability. And those are also hard questions to ask in general, and particularly at this granular level. Those being said, there are a lot of strengths to the FFMP. I think it does build on the decree parties' shared understanding and also stakeholders' shared understanding of these future challenges. Once we come to a common understanding of what we're facing and what our goals and constraints are, that's the first step. It acknowledges what can be win-win situations. If there is low-hanging fruit that gets us a lot of bang for the buck, we're looking at that more aggressively. And then the final strength is both that it commits us to doing more homework. There's 5 studies called for in the FFMP, of which 3 of them are required to be done by the end of the first phase. All the parties are committed to that, and we're making progress getting towards those. And additional studies are looking at different facets where we can make better progress. I kind of answered the first question about how could the FFMP evolve in the future. There will be an evolution as we progress to the second 5-year phase in 2023. The specifics of that are going to be determined by the results of the studies that are ongoing now and additional negotiations. And again, there are specific things called for to be implemented in the second phase, but there also are a lot of things where new things could be implemented or parameters changed. So 2023 and the negotiations up to that, which realistically, given that the time for negotiations and then legal and executive review, negotiations have to start no later than the end of 2022. It's simply hopefully third quarter 2022. And then after that, the FFMP as a 10-year plan expires in the year 2028. And after that, additional negotiations would have to take place, which could be conditioned on the second 5-year phase. The second 5-year phase could have additional add-ons to that. Then finally, to what is the most significant impact of the FFMP to our region? The thermal relief and rapid flow change banks are probably the most popular and well-known of the new parts of the FFMP 2017 to the stakeholder groups. There's been a lot of interest in that, and to date, they've worked relatively well. 2019 was relatively successful. 2020, we did have some challenges. It was a hot year, as Peter noted, and we did have 10 events above 75. Some of those were simply design failures on our part, where it was either warmer or sunnier than we expected. There were also some false positives where we released water unnecessarily. We were working under a hot July. Data from National Weather Service in Binghamton says it was the 3rd hottest July for their station since 1951. So that is, I think, given that we did only have 10 accession events, that's not bad. We could have done better. We try to do better in the future. But what I think is the most significant impact of the FFMP isn't those banks. Those banks have existed in the past. We're using those banks now, but it's these forward-looking components, these opportunities to make bigger changes with a universal acceptance of both the opportunities and the risks. I think that's going to be the most significant impact. If we can design a plan more from the ground up and forward-looking, I think that's going to be the biggest change for the Delaware. Hopefully I didn't go too far over. I think that's all I've got.
Great.
I can answer questions after everyone else is gone.
Thanks, Brennan. Yeah, we're going to have a question and answer session at the end. Next speaker is Jennifer Garigliano from the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. I don't think it's already been said, but the city of New York has a massive water supply system that spans 2 watersheds, right? The Delaware and the Hudson. But it's something like over 50% of the daily water supply to the city of New York comes from the Delaware basin reservoirs that we're talking about here. So I just want to make sure our audience is aware of that. So, and Jennifer spends a lot of time looking over the whole water supply system for the city of New York, but obviously a good portion of that time is focusing on what's going on in the Delaware basin. So Jennifer, with that, go ahead. Jennifer, you may be on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, Jennifer.
Okay, so as Jeff said, you know, my duties and responsibilities are to take care of, you know, the entire water supply system, but I do focus a lot of time and attention on the Delaware system. I have been heavily involved in the flexible flow management program. I took on those duties and responsibilities as we went into the negotiations for the 2017 FFMP. So I've been at it for about 4 years at this point. So my region's level of satisfaction with the FFMP to date, just like if you walked up and down anywhere in the basin, if you asked the general populace what the FFMP was and their satisfaction, they wouldn't have a clue what you were talking about. Water is one of those resources that I think a lot of times people take for granted, and they don't realize that it's such an issue until they go to turn their tap on and it's not there, or that there is a problem. You know, the general population doesn't necessarily see all the work that goes on behind the scenes. It's really the involvement of, you know, the decree parties, the environmental groups, and, you know, all the stakeholder groups, you know, working together on the FFMP. So, you know, it's hard to say what the general satisfaction of New York City is. I would guess they would be very satisfied because they go to turn on their taps and the water is there. We do have education programs, however, in place to get out and teach people where their water comes from and all the negotiations that come into play. For example, we work with high schools in city and the high schools in the Delaware watershed, and we bring them together in, mock negotiations to actually develop water supply programs and whether or not the city should actually have put the reservoirs in place. We're not going to be able to do that this year thanks to COVID-19, but I mean, there's a lot of work behind the scenes to try to get people to understand, where their water is actually come from, so that they can learn about what's happening and the amount of work that goes into these programs. With our work on the stakeholder groups, I would say that there's general satisfaction with the FFMP. As Peter and Brennan had alluded to, for every stakeholder group, there's an equal and opposite stakeholder group. There's a lot of competing interests and a lot of competing needs in the Delaware Basin, which makes it impossible to develop a program that works for everybody. Our job as a decree party is to listen to what the issues are. We each have our own internal issues, and unfortunately, we have to negotiate science to be able to come together and develop a program that meets as many needs as possible. And I think the FFMP and its evolution, has done a very good job in doing just that. And, even though we work so hard to do this, it has its strengths and weaknesses, just like any program, that you would put in place. So one of the strengths of the FFMP is that it takes current hydrologic conditions into consideration. The hydrologic conditions are very different than what they were in 1954 when the Supreme Court issued the amended decree. Since then, we've had the drought of the 1960s. We've had the floods that Peter mentioned. The original decree didn't take into account the ecology, but FFMP, tries to be this comprehensive reservoir releases management plan that tries to meet as many goals and objectives other than just the water supply. So another strength of it is that, FFMP works in conjunctions with already existing programs. So there's the DRBC water code, there's the drought plan, there's New York state regulations. Each state has its own water supply regulations that are out there. And FFMP was designed in a way that it works in conjunction, with all the laws and, programs that are out there and exist. That's the beauty of the first word in there is flexible. It allows us to be adaptive. Some of the weaknesses, that we've talked about already, science is complicated. It takes a lot of resources and it takes a lot of time. Trend analysis can't be done in a week, a month, or even a year. Like, you need time to be able to look and evaluate these programs. And because of that, changes can't happen overnight. And I know people that would like to see a lot more changes, and is there room to grow? Yes. But it does take time and resources to be able to do that science. So, its complexity, I think, is both a strength and a weakness of it. We've also talked about climate change and sea level rise. We need to do a better job looking into the future to see how things within the Delaware River Basin are going to change and how we apply those future predictions into reservoir management and flow management in the river going forward. And not necessarily a weakness, but just to hit back on some of the points that I've already, made. COVID-19 has created its own challenges in and of itself. We are now very resource constrained as part of this, but it hasn't slowed down our science, at least not in my opinion. The decree parties have been very dedicated in getting together and working on the issues, in spite of those additional constraints. And I don't think it has necessarily slowed us down just yet. And with that, moving into how FFMP can evolve in the future, the 2017 FFMP listed several studies in it And because the river and the basin are so complex, you know, to be able to put together a comprehensive study that looks at everything at once is extremely difficult to do. And we're just not able to do that. So we broke it down into bits and pieces of what we considered to be the biggest issues, you know, facing the evolution of the FFMP. We put the renewal in there in 2023 so that when we finished the first 3 studies identified in 2017 FFMP, there's an opportunity for us to make some changes, you know, and improve the FFMP if we can. But the idea with the end of the 10-year period is that we have all the science, you know, we've looked at it, you know, we've beaten it to death essentially, and that we're able to go back and put together a comprehensive plan that better meets all the competing interests and the needs that are out there. So I do think you will continue to see some evolution in the FFMP coming out of these studies. I also want to hit that, you know, perhaps in the past, the decree parties haven't always been, you know, as open to allowing public input into negotiations and into the science. In the 2017 FFMP, you know, the decree parties made a commitment, you know, to work through public forums such as, you know, DRBC's RFAC, you know, to get stakeholder input, to listen to these groups, to put our science out there and our thought process forward, you know, as we're working towards these decisions and a new comprehensive flow management plan for the basin. So I think that it is perhaps a new concept out there that hasn't always been out there in the past, but that is something that is very important to us going forward. You know, the most significant impact, you know, to our regions, you know, for New York City, I would say that it's really the studies in the 2017 FFMP and the commitment to dig deeper into the science and to find ways to do it better. While we have come a long way, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're done. You know, science is always evolving. You know, we get new tools, technology gets better. So we're able to use those new resources that we necessarily didn't have, you know, when the FFMP was first put in place back in 2007, 2008, you know, to develop a program that works better. You know, we're looking forward to the decisions and the science that comes out of these studies, you know, to help us reach our goals. And we're hoping that we're able to find that. So, I mean, the significant impact for New York City would be the studies. So, you know, flow management has come a long way. Like I said, we still have a long way to go. You know, we're open to learning and listening and finding new ways, you know, to do it better, to make it better for everybody, you know, while we manage and protect New York City's water supply. And that's all I have. I mean, we're willing to take questions at the end, but I think that concludes it for me for now.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm going to try to speed us up a little bit here so we have enough time at the end for questions. Next speaker is Liaghat from Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection in Harrisburg. Pennsylvania, of course, as everybody on this call knows, its entire western or eastern border is the Delaware River. So it's got all kinds of considerations for water use, from the trout fishery up north to the bay in the south and everywhere in between, inland reservoirs and the city of Philadelphia water supply. Lots of things to consider, right, Haas? So you're up. Haas, you might have to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now, Haas. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction. Actually, I feel like I don't need to say anything. You said it all. And one nice thing about being the fourth speaker here is that I completely second and agree with everything that you said, Peter said, Brennan, and Jennifer. So maybe, and then the shortage of time, considering the shortage of time, maybe I just expand anything about these questions. If I want to add, that's going to be a repetition. But what you said about what Pennsylvania has or looks at FFMP, maybe a little bit elaborate on that. 7 reservoirs located in PA, which now a part of the study of the storage and into FFMP, we're looking into those as well. They have a significant role in the drought times. However, 43% of the entire population of Pennsylvania, about 5.5 million people, take their drinking water from Delaware. And then out of that population, almost all of that, about over 95 to 97% of this population are located downstream of these reservoirs. So we'll see that how the operation and of these reservoirs is impacting people in Pennsylvania. Now, this was only on the public water supply side of the story, but we have the same story with power generation, yes? So we have over 20 power plant there. They produce over 11 megawatt hour of power, and some of which is actually exported to neighboring states. And that's another industry that is significantly needs water from Delaware. Again, we have been talking about cold water fishery. As you mentioned, we have warm water fishery. We have all kinds of ecosystem, endangered species up to like freshwater wetlands and all these which are tied to Delaware. So in addition to these, we have like a seasonal degradation and emergency cases of spilling, and that's water quality issues that that again, these reservoirs and water in the Delaware are essential to help every ecosystem as well as public water supply. Our recreation, water recreation in Delaware in general is huge. It's a huge industry, and really to that end, every drop of water means a lot for, and then when we say a recreation, we realize that it's not just for, it's all the industry integrated into this recreation. So that's another big thing. Now, flexible flow management, as very good questions was brought up here, originally was like a regulated flow, but we'll see that it is getting into the water management, water resources management of the entire basin. And that's quite another level of responsibility. Fortunately, we all, the states and city work together very well. One thing which we all concerned about, and I noticed that Jennifer introduced us to us too, that we cannot do all the studies at one time, but we realize that we cannot, don't look at things very comprehensively, connected and cumulative effect of everything from all aspects. for a drop of water released from point A to point B. And those are another concerns that, we all realize we have to do. Just another vision or a statement here is that really, Peter mentioned that about so many years of small improvements into FFMP, but after the court of 1952, then there was 1983 of good faith agreement which looked at everything. That took them so many years, but regardless, the computer was not there. But there was no water quality, there was no ecosystem considerations. I think Peter mentioned that very well. Now, to me or to us, to PA, it is like FFMP 2017 is as comprehensive as we are looking at all entitlement responsibilities, and it makes us to be very careful to how to really make sure we have not piecemeal decisions, but have been connected all the dots. As others mentioned, the science is not perfect in that sense. We still don't know what studies, what are the data gaps to get there. And that might be one of our weaknesses at this point. We realize that the science and policy and decision makers are two separate things, but even on the science part, there is some stochastic and probabilistic that Peter mentioned about that, but there is also some values associated with each of these decisions. One day of recreational change has a monetary value. A drought day has a lot of monetary value, which we believe it's significant for all the states, but might be different. And I hope that we get the chance to look at everything comprehensively. And yes, the evolution of FFMP would be toward really a more long-term goal that really ties more science as it releases to us to everything and doesn't end with FFMP 2017. I look at my notes, and as Jennifer mentioned, really we have the opportunities this time to take the advantage of the science of everybody who really wishes to contribute through RFAC, through writing directly to each of us, and as time allows, considering them. We have a PWD and Fish and Boat Commission as like entities that we can use as a consultant, but everyone from any of the participating states are really our stakeholder, and we would like to realize our position as a down basin state. And if they have any knowledge on any of these issues that others mentioned, help us. I think I make it short at this point. If there is any question, then I answer a specific.
Thanks, Haas. Questions are filled here, so we will get to them after our last two speakers. Next speaker is Steve Domber from the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. Steve, thank you for hanging in there with us, and you're up.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you to the coalition for giving New Jersey an opportunity to speak. We've not been engaged with you guys in the past, but we are certainly looking to engage the public through forums like this. So thank you for the opportunity to interact with you guys. You know, I think a lot of the points I was going to make have already been said by my Decree Party colleagues. So let me sort of highlight a couple of things that I think are really important. Jeff, you started by talking about the spatial component of the Ffmp, the upper basin to the lower basin. And I definitely agree with that. Peter and some others talked about the temporal variation of the Ffmp. But I want to spend a minute or two talking about that, and that the Ffmp goes well beyond, started long before the Ffmp. There's a long history of negotiation, litigation, cooperation, and management of the waters of the Delaware River. We go back, in my mind, I'm not getting all of them, but the highlights are a 1932 Supreme Court decree. The states, and New York City ended up in court over management. I think we had the Interstate Commission on the Delaware in there at some point, as sort of a cooperative approach. We have the 1954 Supreme Court decree. Then we have sort of the drought of the 60s and the formation of DRBC. We have the 1983 Good Faith Agreement. And all the various DRBC dockets, which Peter alluded to, that sort of manage flow and drought and fisheries and cold water flows and thermal mitigation, which eventually ended up in the Ffmp, the most recent one being 2017. So there's a long series of water management in the Delaware. The Ffmp incorporates a lot of the previous ones to date. In my mind, sort of the 54 decree sort of set the standard, and we've been modifying that significantly with the Good Faith Agreement. And sort of making additional enhancements with the Ffmp programs. Let me jump down to the last question there. What is the most significant impact to your region? I think from New Jersey's perspective, I would call us a middle and lower basin state. So we are very much interested in water supply, drought, and estuary inflows and saltwater management in the estuaries. Peter spent a lot of time talking about the cold water fisheries in the upper basin. Certainly a very important component. New Jersey is very interested in seeing that thrive. But from our perspective, our stakeholders directly, we are really interested in drought, water supply, flow in the main stem of the river, and saltwater estuary management in the estuary. So the Trenton flow objective, drought management, that kind of thing. The studies sort of talk about salinity and estuary management. And so it's going to be important for the lower basin states of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware to really put our heads together to see how we want to make changes. Typically in the past, these agreements and negotiations have been focused on upper basin issues. So this is new now. And so we are working actively with our partners in Pennsylvania and Delaware to figure out what's best for the lower basin. And so that's been an exciting evolution of these negotiations, and I've enjoyed that and looking forward to continuing that. As I think some of you guys alluded to, the public involvement is another area where all of us agree that we need to sort of engage the public to get their opinions involved better. That is certainly done through the DRBC process, as well as sort of groups like this where we share with you our ideas and our thoughts and get your opinions. That's something that we realize that we need to do more work on, and we are actively trying to do that. And so there's going to be some work to doing that. And we started that. I think the SEF process with the Thermal Mitigation Bank is a great example of how we've done that, and I think to success. We are certainly not going to make everybody happy all the time, as Jennifer alluded to, but that's our job as managers. We needed to balance water supply protection with ecologic flows, with flood mitigation, recreation, all those components we're trying to balance out. I think we can do better. I know we can do better. I know there's opportunities to improve that. I think we all do. The studies sort of outline how we are thinking about that. What are we going to look at in the next 5 and 10-year programs to make improvements? And so that's sort of where we are going with this. I think that's pretty well outlined in that. We are certainly doing the science. The science is evolving. The science is not perfect, but we are making great progress. I will also put a plug in for the Office of the Delaware River Master. They've been very helpful in the last 3 or 4 years with the Ffmp process to sort of facilitate management, facilitate improvements, to bring in outside experts to help us make better decisions. So New Jersey is, I would say New Jersey is most satisfied with the current Ffmp. Doesn't do everything that we like it to, but I think we have a process set up to sort of address those issues. Certainly a complex process. We have lots of competing interests or different perspectives on how to handle things, but there's a process in place that allows us to do that. And this Ffmp 2017 was really a good improvement to do that. I think Brennan talked about the year-to-year versus the 10-year program, and that's huge. That gives us some breathing room to do the science, to do the science right, to make decisions that are informed, and to make decisions that are good for everybody. And so we are pleased with this process. There's a lot of work to do. COVID has created some problems budget-wise, staff level-wise, communication-wise. We're doing Zoom meetings. We're not meeting in person. And that is certainly not my preferred way to talk about these issues in detail, but we're making it happen. And you know, credit to everybody for figuring out how to use Zoom and Teams and everything else to do this. And so we are looking forward to working together to do that. Climate change and sea level rise are certainly issues that are talked about. They were mentioned a couple of times and are forefront of New Jersey's thinking. Governor Murphy and Commissioner McCabe have been very active in sort of identifying climate change and the strategies that we need to address that. FFMP is just part of that. And so that will be incorporated into what we are doing. And I'll leave that there and turn it over back to Jeff.
Thank you, Steve. Excellent. Our next and final speaker is David Wunsch from the state of Delaware. David, you might have to unmute.
This is Stephanie. Can you hear me, Jeff?
Yep.
David's computer locked up. We sent a message to Kelly. He is now trying the call-in number to call back in.
Ah, okay.
Hold on a moment.
Thank you, Stephanie.
You're welcome. Is there another call-in number? Or, I gave him the one for the New York call-in number.
Kelly, are you hearing all this?
Yes, I'm going to stop sharing momentarily and then respond to David briefly.
Okay, thank you.
Jeff, do we want to ask questions while we wait?
Yeah, so we're sorry, we are crunched for time. There's never enough time on this subject matter, no matter what we do. Kelly has said if folks are interested, we can go an extra 5 minutes. That gives us 16 minutes. And then Dave, not sure if David can come back on or not. One of the questions that has come out, Jennifer.
I just got back on.
Okay, go for it.
Sorry about that, folks. My system crashed on me here for some reason, but a good Delaware welcome to everybody. I'll try to just stick quickly to the questions that were asked. And what is our region's satisfaction? I'd say we're pretty satisfied here in Delaware with how the FFMP has worked so far. It seems to be meeting some of the intentions we had, as Peter spoke about. The amount of spillage has been decreased, by better management of the water. I can tell you from my perspective, I've been, a principal now for 10 years since I first arrived here in Delaware. In the first few years I was here, a lot of our FFMPs were just simply us kind of agreeing to extend the previous one with not really much advantage going as far as correcting some of the things. So in any regard, I think that's an improvement that we do indeed have an agreement in plan. Can you all still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And also some other strengths are including that, our plan now doesn't take into account, better water management for ecological needs, fisheries, et cetera, with the understanding that has been mentioned previously, it was not a part of the initial decree. That was done in 1954, and a lot of people don't realize the EPA wasn't created until 1977. So there wasn't nearly as many environmental concerns or consciousness back in those days as there is today. And other strengths, we've really tried to focus our studies on the best science available and using science wherever we can for a better understanding of this complex model. It's more than just mathematical modeling. I mean, we have hydrologic issues to deal with. We have changing conditions with climate change and other things. So we will be looking at all of that. Some of the things that, could use some improvement, we agreed on a lot of studies, but there really was not a mechanism for funding a lot of these. All the states have to contribute a certain amount of money to run the Delaware River Master Office. So we all have some strapped resources, but on the good news side, the USGS chose our basin to be one of the first to do this next gen study where they're doing a comprehensive 10-year study that integrates, hydrology, meteorology, groundwater science, ecology, et cetera. So a lot of data from them and other groups that are also doing studies, I think will be available to us, and that'll be very, very helpful in the future. How could the FFMP involve in the future? Well, as has been mentioned, we do have a 5-year review process written into the agreement, and we will study our progress on issues or look at how things may have changed, conditions or other findings that we have, and we can adjust accordingly. So that is one way we can evolve. And of course, we are open to getting input from people from different forums like RFAC or this event to share our understanding and our information with everybody. Finally, the most significant impact of the FFMP to our region, of course, down in the lower basin, we're concerned about saltwater increases from not only in the estuary, but it's how that affects our groundwater. We're a very low-lying state with sediments that can easily be flooded in a storm, bring salt water in and contaminate our agricultural lands. And of course, that also involves the salt front moving upstream and possible intakes of water. It affects that. Another issue that's really come to light recently is Delaware has been ceremoniously taking down a lot of these historic low-head dams that had powered some of the mills and things. We are kind of at the cradle of the Industrial Revolution. And that's being done to allow more migration of fish and things upstream. But as that happens, you're also allowing potentially saltwater to encroach farther up into some of these tributaries, because dams do make a blockage for saltwater, unless, of course, it overtops the elevation of a dam. So that is one of the things that I mentioned that's most significant for us. Some other things, as Jen mentioned, COVID has changed the world dramatically for us. So, we were supposed to have an in-person meeting, which really does help with our negotiations. Personal relationships are very important. We hosted a face-to-face here in the lower basin in Delaware last year and had all the principals arrive and had a great meeting and showed them some of the types of activities that some of the water purveyors and state government is doing to kind of protect and enhance our freshwater supplies here in the lower basin. But I think that was educational to everybody, and those kind of things help us in the process of negotiating in the future. But that's all I have, and I'll let you get the questions. The good thing about being last, I guess, is most of the other good points have been brought up by my peers. So sorry about the technical difficulties, but that happens with Zoom sometimes.
Thank you, David, very much. So we're going to go to 2:35. If people can hang in there, we do have a bunch of questions. We won't get to all of them. So we did kind of Kelly and I selected what we thought would be most useful for the audience in general. I think, Jennifer, this is probably directed towards you. Folks are interested in what's going on with the Croton water supply system. There was a time where it was felt that if Croton could operate at or near capacity, that might take some pressure off the Delaware water supply and help with the releases in the river below the New York City dams. Is Croton up and running in full capacity, or are there other issues going on?
So the Croton filtration plant is up and running. We have had some issues with geosmin and MIB, which create taste and odor issues in the water. So we've actually recently replaced all of our media in the Croton filtration plant. We went from anthracite over to GAC. So we have, we're in the process of commissioning that right now. So that has taken us down to one plant as we do that. So, we weren't in the filtration business, ahead of bringing this plant online. So it's been a big learning curve for us on how to operate the plant, how to operate it efficiently. So, we continue to evolve those processes and procedures as well, but it is up and running at this point, and we are using the water for water supply.
Right. Thank you. Next question. I'm not sure who this would go to. Anybody can jump in. This is an Upper River question, or from Upper River advocates. There's been a long-standing conversation about the impact of the Lake Wallenpaupack discharge and how it augments the Montague flow target. And many people in the Upper River feel like that creates a negative situation for water releases for the Upper River. The question is there a way, has it ever been considered that there could be credit for Upper River interests when Wallenpaupack is producing and augmenting the Montague flow target? Anybody want to take a shot at that?
I guess I'll take a shot at that one too. So, the power plants can be a bit of a wild card sometimes. The Delaware River Master does have to take those releases into consideration when doing the design of the river. We have thought about, and we've been working with Eagle Creek as part of their FERC relicensing process to try to get provisions in their FERC license to require them to be able to give us better forecast information so that we can better plan what the design is going to be, so that it doesn't necessarily help, so that we don't have these massive yo-yo releases like we've had in the past, because the power plant releases are a wild card. So that's one thing that we're working on. And we have also spoken with Wall and Paulpack in conjunction with the Delaware River Master to just try to get this better forecasted information to help alleviate some of these issues. I mean, there are probably better ways to do it. I know the power plants are working on their modeling and how they do it. But those discussions are happening so that we do get better information so it's not as big of an issue going forward.
Let me add in just that this is fundamentally a decree issue, okay? That to change this would be to change the conditions of the decree, just as to change the 1750 Montague target is also fundamentally a decree issue. So I think there'd be, first of all, a lot of negotiation and science to understand the implications, and then some very heavy negotiations to change something as fundamental as components of the decree.
Great. Okay, Peter, while you're talking, here's one for you. It says, Peter, you noted that currently 12% of the water that comes into the reservoir spills. Do you see an opportunity to use that to supplement releases in the future, or is that the amount of spilling that is unavoidable? What would be the impacts of removing or replacing the Montague target?
Okay, I'm making an educated guess, and I'm looking at Jen as I say this, that New York City has a well-founded policy of trying to keep its reservoirs full at the beginning of the water year. And that is dictated by the fact that, as I said at the opening, that the reservoirs are of limited capacity. So were they not to do that, that would be a risky maneuver on their part. To have that happen, you need to have some spilling. What would be the minimum amount of spilling is a hard thing to determine. My own guess is it would be very hard to get the spilling much below the 12%. If you can't do that, then it's hard to judge what to do with that water. These things are related. The spilling, the Montague flow target are all interrelated fundamental issues. And as Brennan found out in running the thermal thing, as we pointed out in our discussions, we are in this water business always gambling. If we knew how much water was coming in exactly and how much water was going out, everything could be fine-tuned, but it can't be. So everyone's making a gamble. And right now that 12% doesn't look like a very bad gamble to me. Jen?
Right, so, our target is to get the reservoirs full on June 1st, so that we are full going into the summer season when water usage is the highest. We do make discharge mitigation releases leading up to 100%, so we try to minimize the amount of water that does spill out of the reservoirs, but the releases are mechanical, so there's only so much water that we can release out of the reservoir. So there will be times, it's going to rain. No matter how hard we try, we won't be able to make those discharge mitigation releases fast enough, and we will have some spilling. We'll never, I don't think, be able to 100% prevent spilling just because it's a mechanical release.
Okay, we've got just a couple minutes left.
Just real quick to answer the second part of Molly's question, modifications to the Montague and Trenton flow targets are part of the studies. That was one of the facets that all the studies are going to look at.
Thank you, Brennan. The only other question I think I've seen, Kelly, is this, Steve alluded to it, and I think David did too, this business of how do we engage the public in a way that's effective here, recognizing that this is a multi-state and New York City issue. It's confined by the decree to some level. it's not subject to your regular, public information, public comment requirements. In all the things that the decree parties have to do, is there an appetite for, and can we put something substantive together that could help the public better understand this issue and become more engaged in the process? Big question, I know, for only 2 minutes left.
I don't know if I have an answer for all of that, but I did fail. I wanted to mention one thing, that if the public's had a chance to look at our revised River Master website that the USGS had recently designed, I think it's a real improvement. It's got information about the FFMP, but it also has graphics that show you the status of where the water is in the basin, and other graphics and data that's available now. So I think that's a really good educational tool. That's a vast improvement over the previous somewhat static site we had. So kudos to them for doing that.
And Jeff, let me just sort of reiterate what I think I said is we certainly recognize that the need and we have the desire to engage with the public on this. That's been sort of one of our publicly stated sort of goals, and that will continue to happen. But there is not a formal legal process, at least that I'm aware of. And so we will do our best, but I'm sure that may not be satisfactory to everybody on this call, but certainly our wish is to engage you much more than we have in the past.
Excellent. Okay, with that, I'm afraid we probably have to end things. Is that right, Kelly? We're up against it here.
There's actually no more sessions for today, so we have a little bit of flexibility if folks would still like to ask questions.
Or if there's any other comments that our speakers would like to add, that's open too.
Mm-hmm.
That one question, Brennan, that you jumped on from Molly Oliver about the Montague target, and I think one of the speakers said it earlier. I guess Peter said it. How rigid that is. I guess I've often heard Mark Klotz at New York State DEC talk about having more flexibility in a moving, maybe a little bit of a moving target there, based on seasonal variations and conditions, I think is how he often describes it. Does that, am I saying that right, Brennan? And anybody else who wants to comment on maybe the viability of that, recognizing, Peter, it is a decree issue and it would take a big heavy lift?
Yeah, I think the point of that goes to what Peter said at the very beginning, was that the Montague target does not have any real basis in ecological or infrastructure needs. There's no bright point we can say to that 1750 is essential for X. So if releases are being made for 1750 in the absence of other needs, is that water being used wisely? Can the share of water that's dedicated to lower basin use by the 1750 target, can that be used in a better way? I think it's, I don't want to inflame lower basin attitudes here, but it's similar to spill. If 33% of the spill is essentially wasted, it's water that's released when it's not needed, 1750 could be looked at a similar light. And
so Brennan, I will, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. I wanted to phrase that delicately, but I think you take that
absolutely. So I'll start by saying absolutely yes. It's something that we are going to consider along with a host of other changes in scenario and metrics. I will sort of challenge a little bit that it's not a scientifically number. It may be a dated scientific number, but it was a number that we settled on that we thought was very important to maintain main stem and estuary freshwater inflow levels. So it's certainly an important number to the lower basin, at least in New Jersey's perspective. So,
well, I would second that to Steve's comments. And also something I brought up to our USGS colleagues is I would love to see some of the historic data before the decree party lawsuit, if they have that, to see what were the median flows and things at the time before all this, because to me, I don't think we need to decrease these below what was in equilibrium with the basin prior to that. So I think there is some scientific data that can be gleaned from that could help guide these decisions.
I would like to also second Steve and mention that one thing that we should keep in mind that the flow targets, including Montague and also Trenton, really has been working okay or pretty good so far, while we have not been or we have been blessed or not we have not been tested by nature for the wars. Like this year, you saw one for the thermal release, you saw that it was really tricky that at the very end it worked. Yes, the cold weather reached right on the time. About the drought and other things, that's a little bit different. So I'm not saying that 1750 cannot be changed, but really that was one of the things that I was mentioning about holistic or looking at everything all together and not like picking one or two subjects and get very excited about that while the whole system, we cannot cherry pick, I am saying that. So that everything is open for changes as the FFMP 2017 calls for. But some issues are really needs to be looked at more comprehensively.
Okay. I think people seem to be hanging in there. Jennifer, can you see Dan Plummer's question on the chat?
I can, yeah.
Can you read it and then take a shot at it?
Sure. So it says, can you speak to the filtration avoidance determination, or the FAD, that PCN is currently operating under, and what would a world look like if a FAD is not guaranteed in the future? So New York City operates the Catskill and Delaware system of its supply under a filtration avoidance determination. So that means we don't have to filter the water. We have a special waiver from the EPA, now managed by the New York State Department of Health, that allows us to use the water from Papac and Cannonsville and Never Sink without having to filter it. We still treat it with chlorine and UV, but it doesn't have to be filtered. So part of that FAD puts in a series of programs and metrics that we have to meet in order to maintain the waiver and not have to filter the supply. So New York City over the years has invested billions of dollars to ensuring that the water in PCNN is clean enough to drink without having to filter it, that we meet all of the water regulations that are out there, federal, state, water regulations that are out there without having to filter the supply itself. So we're doing, land acquisition programs, whole farm plans, best management practices for farming. We have stream management programs, all sorts of programs that we're investing in to keep the waters of PCNN very clean. As regulations become more stringent, there may become a time where we can no longer comply and we'll have to put in a filtration plant for the Catskill and Delaware systems. We're not there right now. We probably won't be there, for a while. And even if we do get there, we'll never stop investing, into source water protection and taking care of water from its source. We do a very good job, in the FAD, really, is a testament to how clean, or how hard we work to keep the waters very, very clean.
Great. Kelly, are you still with us? I can't, for some reason, I've lost my ability to see any questions coming in.
No worries. This is all that I see currently, Jeff.
Okay. Well, we're 12 minutes over time. Does it make sense, Kelly, that maybe if there's any conclusionary statements that any of our speakers would like to make, I'd like to give them that opportunity, and then we can adjourn. Okay. Hearing none, well, thank you so much, everybody. Really productive session. Again, very dense material, and I hope our audience got a little further down the road here in understanding this complex FFMP. So thanks, everybody, thank you to our speakers, and thanks to the audience who joined today. And thanks, Kelly, for the masterful job of facilitating us through this on the technology front.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone. And again, this is recorded and we'll post it to CDRW's website early next week. Thank you all.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.